Hello everybody, John Greenwood here. Today we're diving into what makes George R.R. Martin's voice distinctive. So we're looking at the nuts and bolts of his prose style. I've done a statistical analysis of his work, examined how his processes kind of changed over time, and I've also provided a sort of step-by-step methodology for replicating one of the most Georgie things in A Song of Ice and Fire, and I've even written a sample chapter for The Winds of Winter to test if these methods actually produce something that gets you part of the way there. So let's get started with part one, which is the big picture. Here we are looking at Latin versus German words, and I'm going to tell you why. So instead of just counting the frequency of words used, whether Martin uses a word or not, you want to actually look at the roots of his word. Where does he get his words from? Because counting the frequency of the words that he has previously used can't predict what words he might use in the future. Instead, if you look at Latin versus Germanic words, you can get a much easier sense of which words he is going to use and which words he isn't going to use without doing the word frequency analysis. And you can more easily predict what types of words that George is going to use in the future. So I did a statistical analysis of the linguistic roots of Martin's vocabulary. You could go a step further by reading the books that he reads. So he reads the ancient Greeks. He also reads Jack Vance a lot. He read Ursula Le Guin. These are the sorts of people that he reads, and he's very open about who he reads. So, you know, the phrase, if you've ever heard it, "you are what you eat," is especially true with writers, and I think it really pops through on the page, George's influences. But I just kind of looked at Latin versus Germanic words. To do this, I looked at 21 different chapters across the series, from early Game of Thrones to late Dance with Dragons, to get a fair spread. I used a program to identify words with Latin or Germanic roots, excluding, you know, the made-up names that George invented, and common stop words like the and is, because those pollute the data, because you're going to be using them whether or not you have more of a Latin or a German leaning. You just can't speak English without, you know, that would be quite a challenge, and it would not be natural English. The results are that Martin's prose is remarkably consistent. Most chapters fall between 12 to 15% Latin density, meaning they are 12 to 15% Latin. So his baseline word choice hasn't really changed in 15 years. What does vary is character and situation. So there's two general bands of Latin density in his books. There's the high band and the low band. The high band sits at 15 to 17%. This is Daenerys ruling in Meereen, basically any Tyrion chapter, and most Ned chapters. So all of these characters and situations are involving rulers and schemers and high lords dealing with politics and abstract ideas and the formalities of court. So higher Latin usage is a lot more appropriate in those situations. And then with the lower band, you have 10 to 13% Latin, usually more around 12%. This is Bran, Jon, and Arya, and Davos. These characters are grounded in the physical world, and the world of survival and nature and the wall and like tangible action. The most notable outlier that I was able to see in the whole series is Daenerys 10, A Dance with Dragons. The infamous brown water, she drank the water and then had to, you know, that chapter. It sits at 9.66% Latin, so it is significantly more German than all of his other chapters, especially Daenerys chapters. So after several books and several chapters of Daenerys using a more Latin voice in Meereen and a more formal voice in both the things that she's verbally saying and, you know, in her own mind thinking, this drop in Latin concentration signals a shift to something like earthier and more honest. It's saying that Daenerys was like, you know, putting on a show. This wasn't really who she is, and now she's turning to something a lot more honest. When you actually look at the language composition of it, a drop of nearly 10% Latin use is just absolutely massive. That's bigger than the difference between George R. R. Martin and J.R.R. Tolkien, which was the next topic that I was going to get to. These percentages, just when you've got them in the void, you can't really make any meaning out of them. You have to have something to compare them to. So J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings, famously actively avoided Latin to create what he thought of as an Anglo-Saxon mythology. He wanted something that feels uniquely old and British and not Latin. So his prose is roughly 6% Latin, which is half of George R. R. Martin's typical usage. So the difference between Daenerys' usual chapters, like 15, maybe 17%, and her latest chapter, which is 10%, this is the difference between George R. R. Martin and J.R.R. Tolkien. Like, it is a massive, huge shift in how the chapter feels. Just to give another point of comparison, I didn't really have anybody else on hand who was easily available to, do the computer analysis. I used my own writing because I'm pretty much a nobody, so I felt it was more fair to use me instead of like somebody who's legendary. My own writing shows basically two different writing voices. I have my academic writing voice, which I use for papers and submissions to the court, and my video scripts, which runs at about 50 to 68% Latin. And so this is, very formal analytical writing. My creative writing ranges from 15 to 23% Latin for fantasy, which is appropriate to the usual figure for fantasy, 35 to 38% for sci-fi, which reflects more of the subject matter of sci-fi because you can't really talk about computers without using Latin words. And my poetry is about 20% Latin, which is probably the closest expression that you can get to the words that I use in my subconscious. For context, most native English speakers write their natural prose around 25 to 30% Latin. I'd say more along the lines of 25%. So Martin's 12 to 15 is lower than normal, and it's deliberately grounded to be more accessible. The reason that Latin density matters is because English uses a mix of Germanic, Latin, French, and Greek roots, mainly Germanic and Latin. And how and when we use these words depends on cultural expectations and context. So although everybody is a little bit different and we all have our own preferences, just for reference, as a native English speaker, personally speaking, if written prose is too Germanic, like Tolkien's 6% Latinate use, the text can feel artificial and clunky to modern readers, as if every word was deliberately replaced from a thesaurus to get rid of the Latin word, which is probably exactly what Tolkien did, although maybe he didn't use a thesaurus. He was an English professor after all. So if something is too Latin, that's like around 40% or higher, then it can feel abstract, stiff, or pretentious unless the context calls for it. So the contexts that would call for using a lot of Latin would be legal documents, academic papers, and formal speeches. We use Latin vocabulary to signal seriousness and that what you're saying is formal. So when somebody is negotiating a treaty, for example, they will use words like sovereign and hegemon and jurisdiction. And in a legal context, it signals to pay attention. This is important. And lawyers consciously use this kind of language because it signals to the court that the person who was using this language understands that what they were saying is legally binding, and they were using this very formal language to be incredibly precise with their words so that the court interprets things in a certain way. So Martin understands when to deploy Latin language and when to use more Germanic language and when to stay grounded. So moving beyond the linguistic roots, we can now look a bit more laser focused on the actual words on the page, the prose part of the prose. How do things flow? How do things sound when you say them out? How does he use punctuation? Does he use the correct verb tenses? Now, since I am not a professional author, you're probably wondering, how is it fair for me to analyze this work? Like, how do I know what I'm talking about at all? Well, what I've done for this analysis is I have referred to the works of other professionals who do analyze work in this way and help other authors become better creative writers. So the person who I am using to analyze Martin's work is Ursula Le Guin. And it's not just because I like Ursula, she's a great author and I do like her. More appropriate to this is that Ursula's work is considered an industry standard among professional authors, and they frequently use her. She was a professional consultant for professional writers. So she's a very fair person to use. And then the second reason that I'm using her, more specific to George R. Martin himself, is that I highly suspect that George R. Martin actually did take advice from her, because we know through his blog posts that he had a professional relationship with Ursula Le Guin, and they knew of each other and they spoke to each other at conferences and so on. So with all of that in mind, I don't think it's too far-fetched for me to say that George R. R. Martin took professional writing advice from Ursula Le Guin. So analyzing George R. R. Martin's prose with Ursula Le Guin in mind, I think is a very, very fair thing to do. It's a very fair standard to hold him to. So the book that we're looking at is called Steering the Craft. Again, this is industry standard used among professionals. Most professionals accept this as a valid thing to analyze prose. And this is exactly what it's meant for. It's not meant for you to write a better story. It's just for prose, just the nuts and bolts of writing. Does your language sound good, basically? So looking at this, one of the most important things that Ursula points out that George sort of struggles with is what she calls crowding and leaping. So crowding means loading your sentences full of vivid, meaningful detail. So you're crowding it with just important stuff. And leaping means having the courage to cut, skip, or imply stuff rather than telling people everything and telling them how to interpret the work. You leave some stuff to be implied. So early on in A Game of Thrones, Martin shows close to mastery. He's very good at it. He's not a complete master, but he is pretty good at crowding and leaping and all the other aspects. I looked at the prologue of Game of Thrones, and it's dense, but it's controlled. Every detail builds mood, character, and plot, and I could only cut about 10% without losing something absolutely vital, which is a very impressive figure. But there are a few instances where Martin kind of tells you how to think, how to interpret a statement or a thought from a character. He's not trusting you to make the implied conclusion, and he just outright says, Garrett was mad or something. Garrett was angry. He had barely suppressed anger. Little things like that. And then also he has a little bit of trouble in his action scenes. He's always had trouble over describing his action scenes. But for the most part, it's fine. And then by Dance of Dragons, this early problem that he's experiencing in A Game of Thrones compounds. So by Dance of Dragons, Martin's editing, his leaping especially, is very weak. So Daenerys 10, A Dance with Dragons, is the clearest example of this. It's the one that most people point to. He did intentionally simplify his word choice to use more Germanic words than Latin words. But while he was paying attention to that, he was not paying attention to the fact that he was creating massive slack in his prose. So when I edited this chapter to kind of quantify how bad the issue is, I was able to cut over 30% of the chapter, like entire paragraphs of redundant introspection, meandering descriptions, and unnecessary stage direction, and telling us how to think rather than letting us come to the conclusions ourselves. He is leaving no space at all for the reader. So the popular impression that Martin has become a long-winded and self-indulgent author isn't just a feeling. It's actually quantifiably true in the case of Daenerys 10, A Dance with Dragons. The craft is still there in his word choices and, some of his flowery language, but the pacing, rhythm, and white space has gotten a lot weaker. And Ursula was reminding people that what you don't say and the pacing and the rhythm is just as important as having beautiful prose when you do say something. So it seems that Martin has sort of lost sight of this objective. I'm now going to go over some specific examples. We're going to start with the Game of Thrones prologue. Everybody's read this, so I'll show you my editing process very quickly, and I'll highlight some patterns that become even worse problems later. So the first pattern is telling instead of showing. Martin writes that Waymar Royce was disinterested, but the dialogue already shows this. We don't need to be told that. Similarly, barely suppressed anger is redundant when we already see the tightness around Garrett's mouth and the anger in his eyes. Both redundant and telling us instead of showing us when he's already written another sentence that does it the correct way. So he's being a little redundant here. The second pattern is a weak passive voice in certain places. Now, contrary to what many publishers will tell you, Ursula says that having a passive voice is actually appropriate, and sometimes, right, like, again, if you were having a treaty negotiation between two politicians, they might use passive voice to kind of talk around the issue rather than getting straight to it. But here, it was not the appropriate place to use passive voice, especially with this kind of character who probably wouldn't think in those ways. The sentence that I wanted to point to here was that Garrett was not accustomed to being made light of, could be stronger. You could say, mockery sat ill with him or something like that. The third problem with George's work is exposition dumps. So sometimes he performs these well and they're integrated well into the text, and then other times he's not as great at it and the text feels clunky and kind of forced. So the paragraph about Will being a veteran of 100 rangings in the haunted forest feels kind of clunky because it uses language that Will probably wouldn't use, and it kind of breaks his POV a little bit. Probably a better version of the same sentence is the haunted forest was a name for southern tongues. The woods held no more ghosts for Will. And then you transition into the next paragraph, until tonight. So we're replacing there's no more terrors with there's no more ghosts, which fits in better with, the idea that there's going to be dead people in the rest of the chapter. So it ties in more nicely with how Will thinks and, still conveying the same expository information, just phrased in a different, smoother way. And then the fourth thing is dialogue tags. Oh my gosh, this is a Georgism. Martin leans very heavily on the structure of 1, there's a quote, and then 2, character verbed, 3, quote continues. For example, the structure is basically like, Bob, Sally said, will you be eating that cheese? This sort of structure is a facet of George's writing, his voice. This is because George is actually a screenwriter and he's trying to replicate cinematic pacing on the page in a sort of roundabout way. And this is fine occasionally, but personally I think he overuses it. But even with all of these minor issues, the prologue is only 3,800 words, and I could only cut about 10% of it, so I was able to cut it down to about 3,400 words, which is an impressive level of control from George, especially compared to his later stuff. I'm going to read out some of the worst bits that I had to change in the prose on the screen now. I don't want to read through the whole chapter because, everybody's read this. The first thing that I wanted to point out was right at the start, literally the very first chapter of A Song of Ice and Fire. We have somebody evacuating their bowels, and this becomes... I'm sure people on the meme channels are aware of this. This is so tired in George's work. He really does this way too much. At the beginning of the series, this is a fresh take for the reader, so it's fine, and that's why I didn't cross it out. But when people get afraid, not everyone evacuates themselves in fear. And GRRM uses this with everybody. He seems to think that everybody responds to fear in this way in every situation, and that's just not true. You have some style inconsistencies later on. there's a section where they're talking about Sir Waymar Royce. As it reads now, Sir Waymar Royce had been a sworn brother of the Night's Watch for less than half a year, but no one could say he had not prepared for his vocation, at least insofar as his wardrobe was concerned. This is George's voice leaking through. It's too complicated for Will, who's supposed to be sort of dumb and lowborn. He wouldn't use all of those complicated words. I used the word job instead of vocation. I feel like that's something that Will might say, but you could also use work. Sir Waymar had been a sworn brother of the Night's Watch for less than half a year, but no one could say he had not prepared for his work. At least he dressed the part. And then you get into the description of his cloak. So just some style inconsistencies. The rest of the stuff is very repetitive. I cross out a lot of redundancies, so it's best not to get into them. I'm really just trying to focus on the worst stuff in this chapter. Here's a really bad example of telling the reader how to think. Sir Waymar Royce is saying, "And how did you find the wall?" "Weeping," Will said, frowning. He saw it clear enough now that the lordling had pointed it out. They couldn't have froze. Not if the wall was weeping. It wasn't cold enough. We're telling the reader that Will is making the connection, and to me this is just kind of obvious. We can still point out that Will is realizing things without doing it in this very complicated way. We can do it with 2 words instead of 2 sentences. So how you do that is, "And how did you find the wall?" "Weeping. They couldn't have froze," Will realized. Not if the wall was weeping. It wasn't cold enough. Right? So, yeah. And then immediately after this was the first paragraph that I was able to spot that doesn't need to be in here at all. Even normal people understand that in medieval times, people give orders and you have to obey it. We get the sense that Royce is in charge and that they're reluctantly following his orders. So this entire paragraph was unnecessary. The next few errors, again, I don't want to get into them very much, is once the others start to show up, redundant information, redundant sentences or paragraphs, or telling the viewer. I'm not just going to discuss them too much because they're all sort of the same issue. Overall, the chapter was fine, and again, I could only omit 10% of it. It was 3,800 words, and I cut it down to about 3,400. So now we have sort of a baseline or what George's prose was like back in the day. And now we're going to look at George's prose more recently. I say recently, but it's been over a decade. So the same patterns that we found in A Game of Thrones that were more minor have now compounded into serious problems after decades of not really tackling them. So the chapter in its original form is 6,771 words, up from 3,800. He almost doubled the length of his chapters here. I was able to cut it to 4712, which is a 32% reduction, and it's only 1,000 words more than the prologue of A Game of Thrones. So it's right on par with his old writing. I don't want to go over every single example because we're going to be here for hours. If I do, I'm just going to show a few examples and some of the worst parts, and you can pause on screen to read through most of it, and I'm just going to point out like the worst stuff. So here's some examples. Again, we see the redundant information qualifiers. So Dany says, "Felt as if she had the beginnings of a fever," can just become "she had the beginnings of a fever." We're in her head. We don't need "she felt," right? And although this is a minor edit, like when you do this over and over and over and over again, like you are saving literally hundreds of words over the course of a chapter that's 7,000 words long, right? That's a massive percentage cut just off of those things. And I haven't even really gotten started yet. This is just minor stuff. The big one in this chapter is expository reminders. We have something like, "She had no memories of that Dragonstone, but she would not soon forget this one." Like, we know that Daenerys was born at Dragonstone. We've read the 5 books. Just cut this. You don't need this. And, telling the viewer what happened in the first book, like, we don't need this. If they need a reminder, they can go back and read the first book. right? That's what they're there for. Just cut this stuff. This is totally redundant and unnecessary information. And then we have over description. There's no nice way to say this. There's like an entire 200-word paragraph about the grass and the wind that basically only exists to show that Martin has poetic abilities. Like he can write. He's a serious writer. A lot of people get confused by the professional advice to kill your darlings, right? You hear this in writing advice all the time, but it's been divorced from its context so much that people have no idea what it means. People seem to apply this to George's work by saying like, oh, like you have too many characters, you have to kill your darlings, you have to kill your characters because your characters are your darlings. That is not what kill your darlings means. That is not what it originally meant. That is not what it's referring to. Darlings are those poetic little bits of writing that you put so much effort into, but ultimately you realize that they're redundant and they have no place in the story, but you get tempted to include them anyways because, oh, I put so much into it and oh, it's so beautiful. This is your darling. This is the darling that needs to be killed, okay? This paragraph right here on screen, this is a darling of George, and it needs to be killed. And a good editor would be able to do that. I don't know what's going on in the editing process. If I had to guess, it was probably a time thing that they didn't catch this because the book is just so massive. But this clearly needs to go. And again, I'm going to show you visually a few other paragraphs on screen right now where it's pretty bad. Like you can see visually from my edits of the first the prologue from the first book to this chapter, like I'm able to get rid of a lot more, and I'm not really even like rephrasing things or doing that much editing. I'm literally just deleting entire paragraphs and sentences that are just completely redundant. Again, I'm going to read through a couple of the worst examples. As the sun was gliding, the distant spires of Dragonstone. That's verbatim. Sorry, guys. There's a missing word there. So, you know, whatever. Like, I didn't even correct that stuff. As the sun was gliding, the distant spires of Dragonstone, Dany stumbled onto a low stone wall, overgrown and broken. Perhaps it had been a part of a temple or the hall of the village lord. More ruins lay beyond it, an old well, and some circles in the grass where hovels had once stood. They had been built of mud and straw, she judged, but long years of wind and rain had worn them away to nothing. Dany wedged herself into the corner, making a nest with handfuls of the grass. The night was cold, the ground hard, her belly empty. She found herself thinking of Marine, of Dario, and blah 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 blah. We get back into his writing. But do you see how this kind of flows a lot better, and we get rid of a lot of the really slow pacing, and like this is, you know, unnecessary information. Another bit that was really unnecessary was the bit about the ants. Now, I get why the ants are here. I get the symbolism of the ants, but we don't need to linger so long on the ants. The next morning, she woke stiff and sore and aching, with ants crawling on her arms and legs and face. She had bites all over her, little red bumps, itchy and inflamed. She knocked them off and crushed them under her bare feet. There were so many. It turned out that their anthill was on the other side of her wall. She wondered how the ants had managed to climb over it and find her. Viserys told her tales of nights so poor they had to sleep beneath the ancient hedges that grew along the byways of the Seven Kingdoms. Dany would have given much and more for a nice thick hedge, preferably one without an anthill. The sun was only coming up. She wanted to lie back down, close her eyes, and give herself up to sleep. No, I must keep going. The stream, just follow the stream. So I'm sure you can tell that we have spent a lot less time. What did we lose? That there's dry brown grass? Questioning where the ants came from, even though we get the answer like a few seconds later. That she's brushing the ants off, like that's already conveyed by she knocked them off. And then I also cut a description of the stars being in the sky, like talking about Khal Drogo and remembering Khal Drogo and looking about how the hill behind her is still close and she could still go back. Redundant because we get that information later on about, you know, her struggle of whether she's going to turn back or not. It's just pointless, redundant information. And then we're going to get to the famous famous section of this book, of this chapter in particular. So here we go. We're just going to get into it. I'm going to read it over with my edits already in mind, and you'll see how it flows a lot better. Dany cupped her hands to drink. The water made her belly cramp, but cramps were easier to bear than thirst. She had no other drink but the morning dew that glistened on the tall grass, and no food at all. Her whip slapped softly against her thigh, whap, 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 one step at a time, and the stream would see her home. Just past midday, she came upon a bush growing by the stream with hard green berries. Dany squinted at them suspiciously, then plucked one and nibbled at it. Its flesh was chewy, with a bitter aftertaste that seemed familiar to her. In the Khalasar, they used berries like these to flavor roasts, she decided. Saying it aloud made her more certain of it. Dany found herself picking berries with both hands and tossing them into her mouth. She spent the rest of that day retching up green slime. If I stay here, I will die. I may be dying now. My flesh will feed the wolves and carrion crows, she thought sadly, and worms will burrow through my womb. Sunset found her squatting in the tall grass. Every stool was looser and fouler than the one before. The water was killing her, but she could not fight her thirst. When she closed her eyes at last, Dany did not know whether she would be strong enough to open them again. She dreamt of her dead brother. Viserys looked just as he had the last time she'd seen him. "You are dead," Dany said. And so we continue through the rest of the chapter. So hopefully that rendition of the same chapter was made a lot less unbearable and painful to read by just cutting a lot of stuff and replacing like a couple words. Then skipping ahead way off past the Jorah hallucinations, she's kind of brought back to reality by a stone under her foot. She trips on it, and then there's a bunch of expository details about the description of the grasslands around her. It's supposed to be a suspenseful moment, and instead of these pauses adding suspense, they just completely take the tension away from the moment. Simple solution is just to get rid of them and get rid of the redundant information. So here's how that looks. The stone turned under her foot. She stumbled to one knee and cried out in pain, hoping against hope that her bear would help her to her feet. But when she turned her head, he was gone. The wind, she told herself, the wind shakes the stalks and makes them sway. Only no wind was blowing. She fumbled in the water, found a stone the size of her fist, pulled it from the mud. From the corner of her eye, Dany saw the grass move again, off to her right. Through the grass came a soft, silvery tinkling. Bells, Dany thought, smiling, remembering Khal Drogo and the bells he braided into his hair. Blah, 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 blah. A rider appeared. Blah, 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 blah. A hunting bow and quiver of arrows were slung from his saddle. A scout. If he found her there, he would kill her or enslave her. At best, he would send her back to the crones of the Dosh Khaleen. He did not see her, though. Dany followed his eyes, and there the shadow flew with wings spread wide. And so we continue through the rest of the paragraph. And again, just at the very, very end here, again, I think these descriptions are supposed to be adding, a moment of pause, a moment of tension, right? This would be like, if he was writing a screenplay, he would be inserting like beat, but it just doesn't work that way in the prose. It comes off completely redundant, and we want to speed things up when there's action, so we're speeding things up here by getting rid of a lot. A vast herd of horses appeared below them. There were riders, too, a score or more, but they turned and fled at the sight of the dragon. But as swift as they were, they could not fly. Soon one horse began to lag behind the others. The dragon descended on him. Dany clutched the dragon's neck with all her strength to keep from sliding off. The carcass was too heavy for him to bear back to his lair, so Drogon consumed his kill there, tearing at the charred flesh as the grasses burned around them. Dany, starved, slid off his back and ate with him, ripping chunks of smoking meat from the dead horse with bare, burned hands. In Meereen, I was a queen in silk, nibbling on stuffed dates and honeyed lamb, she remembered. What would my noble husband think if he could see me now? Daario would laugh, carve off a hunk of horse meat with his arak, and squat down to eat beside her. As the western sky turned purple, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Dany rose, wiped her hands on her ragged undertunic, and went to stand beside her dragon. That was how Khal Jacko found her, when 100 mounted warriors emerged from the smoke. Just at the end there, the color of a blood bruise thing isn't necessarily a mistake. It's just an overused metaphor in his books. It's one of his Georgisms. There's nothing wrong with saying purple or a synonym for purple. You don't have to use a metaphor for the color of the sky. So yeah, that's those are the worst parts of it, but I'm sure you can see visually speaking just how much I was able to cut from this chapter. The original was 6771 words, and the new count was about 4712 words, which was a cut of 32%. So now that you have a bit of specifics on how George writes and some of the flaws in his writing and a lot of the Georgisms and the mistakes he usually makes, I wanted to point out one of his strengths, which was his use of memory to hide exposition and clues. I think this is a brilliant device, and he uses it very effectively. Martin uses an almost invisible pattern formula to deliver exposition without it feeling like an info dump. So I've distilled this into a 5-step process. Step 1 is a boring task. This is going to start with the character doing some kind of mindless activity, like reading a scroll, or walking around, or riding, or cleaning their sword, or sewing. It's just something that's meant to put their body on autopilot so that their mind can wander somewhere else. And then step 2 is the sensory trigger that makes their mind do that wandering. So there's this small concrete detail, this sensory thing that's going to flip a mental switch for them. For example, in the Dany chapter, there's the taste of the berry that reminds Dany of Dothraki customs. And then you've got step 3, which is, the info dump, the exposition. Now Martin is going to deliver what would otherwise be a very boring exposition dump. We learn about Dothraki marriage customs, Lannister family history, or lore from the north, but because we're seeing it through the character's lived experience and with their emotional lens and, the emotional impact that this had on them, it feels more like a story. And so it's a lot more fun to learn about the lore this way. Step 4 is the clue sandwich. So Martin knows that readers focus on the big emotional beats in his memories. So he hides clues between 2 other details, sandwiching them between 2 other different things, making them look like throwaway lines. For example, in Daenerys' memory of fleeing the fighting pits, the obvious drama is Hazar possibly poisoning her with locusts. Again, if you missed this was in Daenerys 10, Dance with Dragons. Anyways, but the sandwiched clue in the chaotic description is that George casually drops that Hazar shouted for men to kill Drogon, and they obeyed, right? The reason that crossbows and spears are flying at Daenerys as Drogon is flying away is because Hazar shouted for the men to do that. And some of them actually hit Drogon, and they could have killed Daenerys quite easily, right? So her husband ordered her death. And it's mentioned with the same weight as, like, the color of the sand in the pit or the sound of the crowd. Like, it's hidden in plain sight, and it's sandwiched between 2 other things so that you casually pass over it as if it's some nothing detail. But when you think about it, wait a minute, and this is where a lot of the reread value comes from, is, wait a minute, I was totally focused on, like, how epic it was to escape from the pit and the chaos and, oh my god, the drama, and oh my god, the locusts. But no, the important thing was her husband shouted for her men to kill her. They obeyed him. That has implications. But anyways, step 5 is the snap back to reality. So something jolts the character back to the present. So Daenerys trips on a rock in Daenerys 10, or maybe a door slams in their face, or maybe a voice is addressing them directly. This re-anchors both the character and the reader in the current scene, making the whole memory feel like a real, actual, intrusive thought instead of an exposition device. So this really works. Why this matters is different for readers and for writers. So for readers, understanding this pattern is kind of like a cheat code, because it tells you basically when to pay attention. So those throwaway lines and memories are often the most important information. So yeah, it's really easy to find them when you know where they are. And for writers, this is kind of a blueprint. This is a great device for burying exposition, hiding clues, controlling pacing, and bridging scenes for when you kind of have a bullet point list of plot points that need to happen in this chapter, but you just have no idea how to bridge them. put a memory in there. Based on everything I've shown so far and talked about so far, here's a blueprint, a practical guide on how to mimic Martin's style and get pretty close to what he might sound like. First of all is the Latin density. Your target number is going to be 12%. It could be between 12 and 15% Latinate words, excluding stop words, but really your target is going to be get as close to 12% as possible. I mean, it depends on the character, of course, so you might want 15 to 17% if you are writing about a ruler, like a Cersei chapter would probably have higher stuff. A Daenerys chapter, a Tyrion chapter would probably have a higher band of Latin density. So these are rulers, schemers, or formal political scenes or court dialogue. And then you want the lower band of 10 to 13%. Again, target is 12 for more earthy, honest moments or survival situations. How you can do this, practically speaking, is you write the chapter. Then after you've written the chapter, you analyze your Latin density. If it's off, search for Latin words in your work and adjust the word choice to more Germanic or Latinate vocabulary. So you can use a thesaurus to help you pick out more Germanic words. And this is going to adjust your Latin density to be closer to the target. It doesn't have to be exactly 12%. It can be a little bit off. But if it's very far off from the target, right, like a few percentage points, is a very big difference, right? Remember, the difference between George and J.R.R. Tolkien is about 6%. That is a really big feeling difference for native English speakers. So even a difference of 6% is like massive. Just pay attention to your Latin density. And then that'll also give you an idea without having to do a formal statistical analysis of like which kinds of words that George is going to use, right? If it's a big, complicated Latin word like maximum, George probably isn't going to use that for a fantasy novel. Maybe there's a new character, right, from Norvos or something, or Pentos. Maybe they are going to use maximum. But other than that, like Jon Snow is probably never going to say the word maximum. It just doesn't feel like a word that he would say. Or Davos. Yeah, probably Davos. Of course, I'm going to eat my own words when George releases Winds of Winter tomorrow and he uses the word maximum in every single chapter, but whatever. So the second part of the blueprint is use the memory device. Nearly every chapter should feature at least one memory sequence, and you use this to deliver exposition dumps, hide clues, and transition between scenes when you don't have a clean way to transition between them. This is a 5-step process. Step 1 is the boring task. This is walking, reading, or some kind of physical activity. Step 2 is the sensory trigger, so taste, smell, physical sensation, maybe a sound. And then you got the exposition itself. And then you have the clue sandwiched as a throwaway line between different things. I mean, sometimes it's somewhere else, but typically it's sandwiched. He likes to sandwich them. And then you have the snap back to reality. The physical interruption returns the character to the present and away from the memory. The third thing is some common Georgisms. These patterns appear consistently in Martin's work. So dialogue structure, you got the Bob, Mary said, would you like to eat this cheese, right? Quote, character verbed, quote continues. Use this for cinematic pacing, but maybe consider using it less than Martin does. But he definitely does use this if you want to mimic exactly what he sounds like. Then there's the evacuating their bowels when afraid trope. He uses this a lot, and it's honestly kind of funny. And then purple bruises. When describing purple, Martin often uses the color of a bruise or something to describe purple instead of just saying purple. I don't know why he just doesn't use the word like plum or something, or just saying purple. I don't get it. Telling instead of showing. Martin often tells us that characters are angry or disinterested instead of trusting the dialogue. Later, Martin in A Dance with Dragons does this a lot more. I would avoid this, but it is a Georgism. And those are the three sort of things to keep in mind when you are trying to write like George R. R. Martin. To test whether I have done my research right and whether this blueprint does actually bring you fairly close to what he sounds like, I used the released sample chapter from The Winds of Winter, Theon 1, as kind of a baseline, as a source, because the current version that's released reads a lot like a first draft. If you haven't read the sample chapter from The Winds of Winter, or you want to generally avoid spoilers for The Winds of Winter, I would recommend not listening to this, because there are going to be things from The Winds of Winter in here. I am actually using George's work here. These are a lot of this is like real stuff that happens in The Winds of Winter. So if you're trying to avoid that sort of thing, now's the time to be warned about it. I also don't want to spoil how much of this is George's and how much of it is mine, right? Because I will say that part of this is actually George's actual words. Does this sound like George R. R. Martin's work? Is the illusion convincing enough? Was it close, right? Like, did I get close? Did it almost work except for a few things? Or was it like, how did it feel, basically? I would really appreciate if you left a comment. If you haven't read the Theon sample chapter, or even if you have, how much of this felt close to George's voice? Was this successful? So that's the whole goal of this. Whether this is actually a relatively accurate read on how George writes. Okay, so hope you enjoy. Here is Theon 1, The Winds of Winter. The bite of his iron shackles ached against the raw flesh of Theon's wrist even as the key set him free. He would have fallen if not for the hands that seized him. 2 hands, 4 hands, 6 hands as hard as stone on his arms, his back, and his neck. I am going to die today, he thought. His legs betrayed him. They had not known their own weight while he hung from the wall of the stone keep that Stannis took his quarters. The floor rushed up, and the world became a struggle of labored grunts and dragging, and rough rope replaced the shackles as his bindings. Up, a man growled behind him like a master to his dog. His guard was northern. He could feel it in the hate of his voice. The blow landed square between his shoulders, a heavy wet thump that sent a jolt of pain lancing up his spine. Reek's pain. Theon felt it from a distance through a thick fog, watching himself from the corner of the room. The world swam in muddy colors. The soot on the stone ceiling, the red of the king's brazier, the grim face of a guard. He saw it like the bottom of the well in Winterfell. I threw the septon down that well. The hands hauled him upright. Walk, said the voice. He tried. His steps made a mockery of walking, a broken thing like the broken dolls of the crofters' boys he murdered. Shump, 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 shump. The sound was wrong. He was wrong. How could he remember their broken dolls but not their names? Theon, he thought. My name is Theon. You have to remember your name. He remembered many things, but not their names. He remembered their tears and their faces. He remembered their screams and their struggling, and the laughter he gave them as he carved their father's throat with his dagger, the dagger that Mikken made him. What he did to their mother was best forgotten, but he remembered. The gods remembered. The North remembered. The thick oak door opened with a gust of cold black wind and a swirl of snow. Theon was blinded when the men kicked his face into the snow. He did not put up his hands to stop the fall. I deserve this, he thought. The air was so cold that it burned his lungs with each breath. The gritty white powder clung to his skin like a cold sweat, and for a moment he was not there, but back in the icy clutch of Winterfell with the sharp taste of blood in his mouth, with only Jane Poole's weak breaths beneath him in the dark of the winter storm. The outer wall of Winterfell was 80 feet high, but beneath the spot where he had jumped, the snows had piled up to a depth of more than 40. A cold white pillow. The girl had taken the worst of it. Jane. Her name is Jane, but she will never tell them. Theon had landed on top of her and broken some of her ribs. You saved me, Jane had whispered as he was carrying her through the snow. She was pale with pain, but she had brushed one hand across his cheek and smiled. I saved Lady Arya, Theon whispered back. And then all at once Mors Umber's spears were all around them. If Crowfoot and his men had not been outside the castle, Ramsay would have had them both in moments. Mors Umber was an old man, huge and powerful, with a ruddy face and a shaggy white beard. He had been seated on a garron, clad in the pelt of a gigantic snow bear, its head his hood. Under it, he wore a stained white leather eye patch that reminded Theon of his uncle Euron. He He wanted to rip it off Umber's face, to make certain that underneath was only an empty socket, not a black eye shining with malice. Instead, he had whimpered through his broken teeth and said, "I am a turncloak and a kinslayer. You will hold that lying tongue, or lose it," Crowfoot finished. But Umber had looked at the girl closely, squinting down with his one good eye. "You are the younger daughter?" Jane had nodded. "Arya. My name is Arya. When last I was inside those walls, your cook served us a steak and kidney pie, made with ale, I think. Best I ever tasted. What was his name, that cook?" "Gage," Jane said. "He was a good cook. He would make lemon cakes for Sansa whenever we had lemons." Crowfoot had fingered his beard. "Dead now, I suppose. That smith of yours as well. A man who knew his steel. What was his name?" Jane had hesitated. Micken, Theon thought. His name was Micken. The castle blacksmith had never made any lemon cakes for Sansa, which made him far less important than the castle cook in the sweet little world she had shared with her friend Jane Poole. "Remember, damn you, your father was a steward. He had charge of the whole household. The smith's name was Micken. I had him put to death before me." "Micken," Jane said. Mors Umber had grunted. "Aye." What he might have said or done next Theon never learned, for that was when the boy ran up, clutching a spear and shouting that the portcullis on Winterfell's main gate was rising, and how Crowfoot had grinned at that. When Frey's riders came out, they fell into the pits, and then Umber's spears fell into them. The killing was hardly over when Crowfoot gave him a horse and sent him to Stannis' camp with the Braavosi banker and his guards. "I saved her," he thought. This was his thanks. How long had he been hanging there? The weight of his body had torn his shoulders from his sockets, and his wrists were still chafed bloody from the metal. They had given him no food, nor asked him many questions. Theon heard the stomping of boots from the floorboards above the cellar sometimes, or shouting, or the muttering of words if the wind died down enough for him to listen. There was little else to do, chained to a wall. "My brother's debts," the king had muttered. He had heard the men speak of how all the ink in the camp had frozen over. They said Stannis had drawn his dagger and signed a contract with the Bank of Braavos with his own blood. The day he arrived, Stannis had the banker leave for Eastwatch with Sir Justin Massey, for Lord Bolton would be upon them soon, and he would not have the banker caught in the fight. Jane had gone with them, to be delivered to the Night's Watch along the way. To Jon, Theon thought. His brother was now Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. He wondered what Jon would do with her. He'll protect her, he decided. He was always playing hero in the yard. He had heard Stannis speak of his debts and wondered how he would ever repay the blood he spilled. Somehow, he thought all the 7 kingdoms would not balance the scale. The king himself only spoke twice to Theon. When he first arrived in the storm with Jane in his arms, Stannis had grimaced at the sight of him, or the smell of him. He could tell that he smelled awful. Ramsay liked him that way. But that was when he was Reek. Now he was Theon again. Theon, aye. Theon, the gods had said. Theon Turncloak was all Stannis had to say at first. Take him to the tower. I would have answers. He got them. Theon gave the king his answers and so much more. How many men were in the castle, their numbers, their postings, how far a man could see from atop the battlements, the sigils and houses in the feasting hall, the kitchens, Abel and his washerwomen, and the crypts, and Lady Dustin, and the hooded man, and the missing swords. When they asked about Lord Eddard's bones, he told them about that, too. Theon told them about the Frey riders who begged for the mercy of death after the stakes went through their legs and their bellies. He told them about their plan and their escape, about the long-legged woman, about Freya's rope and their jump off the wall. He told them about Arya, the real Arya, not Jane, never Jane. I saved her. He told them everything. Everything but the name Jane Poole, how she tasted on his tongue, and the things Ramsay made them do. By the end, he had even told them about how many times Lord Wyman had gone to the privy. When? How long? Who was here and who was there? It was an endless assault of questions, and it was the first time in a long time that anyone had cared to listen to what Theon Greyjoy had to say. When Theon told them about Karstark's letter, they had questions for him, too, and for Maester Tybalt, the Maester of the Dreadfort brought by Lord Arnulf on the march. Karstark had brought 3 ravens, and all 3 flew only to Winterfell. There were just 2 left in their cages. There was Jon's letter as well, the one with the seal of black wax delivered by hand by his riders. Theon could not remember the last time he laughed so hard. You should name this Turncloak Tower, your grace, he had smiled at the king as Arnulf Karstark tried to break free beside him. Stannis had ground his teeth at that. A leather hand closed on the scruff of his furs and hauled him from the snow. "This is better than you deserve, kinslayer," the armored man spat. "We ought to have burned you with the Karstarks for the Lord of Light. A cleaner, purer end. Be glad that it is not I who decide your fate." A shove sent him staggering forward into the wind, and the filthy snow of a camp long past its due churned beneath his feet. The guards took him well past the longhouse of the lords, past the horses, and beyond the black ruin of the site of Lord Arnulf's remains. The ground hardened under him. Ice, he thought. We're on the lake. Theon had been here before, in another life. He had been 3 and 10, he reckoned, the first time Lord Eddard had let him out of his sight. There had been a boar ravaging the chickens in the night, and Stark had taken them on the hunt. When Theon realized how far he had ridden ahead of the others, for a wild moment he had dreamed of turning his horse south and west, riding all the way to the sea, and finding a ship brave enough to dare the wrath of Winterfell and carry him to Pike. But it was a boy's dream. Lord Stark had known it, and deep down, so had Theon. There was no ship for him, and Sansa Stark was not at Pike. Sansa, sweet Sansa with her auburn hair and the armor she always wore around him. It was Sansa who had first made Theon see himself as a man grown, with a man's wants and a man's hungers. Now he was no man at all, not after what Ramsay had taken. And whenever he tried to imagine Sansa in his head, all he could see was Jane. The thought hurt more than the cold. Jane, her name was a stone in his throat. She had been his salvation and his ruin. The only warmth in a world of endless winter, and he had dragged her through all the hells and back. He had no right to feel anything for her. You do not love her, he thought to himself. You can't. You are Theon Turncloak, Theon Kinslayer. Love was a song for better men, whole men, but her trembling breath beneath him in the dark, her skin as fair as the snow around them. No. No! He shook his head to cast the thoughts aside. It's all your fault. You did this to her. Death is more than you should hope for. But another part of him clung to her as she had clung to him, to the feel of her body pressed against his on the horse, of her arms around his chest, and her breath against his back. Her memory held a warmth that shamed him more than all his betrayals. "She is safe," he said aloud. "I saved her. I saved—" The words were thin as rotted wool. The man from Bear Isle snorted. "You fell. Umber saved her." "She is safe," he told himself. "Jon will see her to safety. She will live. She will forget." The thought brought him some small comfort. The idea of Jane Poole living, healing, growing old in some quiet place without his shadow beside her. They stopped. The crowd loomed before him, and Stannis stood waiting by the heart tree, black birds covering its branches. There seemed to be more birds than snowflakes in the sky, and all at the tree. Theon raised his eyes to his sister. "Tell me how you took the castle. Show me the tunnel, and I shall remember it when I take your sister to bed," Sir Justin had said to him one night. "I didn't take a tunnel. There's no tunnel. I swear," he had wept between the fists. Asha could not meet Theon's stare. That was good. It meant she still had her dignity. They had not touched her or broken her yet. "Remember your name," a voice seemed to whisper on the wind. It did not sound like his own. "Theon," he thought. "My name is Theon Greyjoy." And then, a confession so quiet he could hardly hear it in his own thoughts. "And I loved a girl named Jane Poole." He did not know if it made him more a man or less. The guard's hand tightened on his arm to lead him the final steps. Theon took a breath of frozen air and waited for the end to begin. The guard stopped him in front of the great white weirwood. Its face swept slow crimson tears of sap that froze upon its bark. The ravens clustered in its branches were silent, hundreds of black bees, watching from above. The king looked more a figure carved from ironwood than a man. His face was taut skin over sharp bone, his eyes sunk in deep, bruised hollows. He wore a plain ringmail hauberk, with grey dull links and a sheath with the hilt of a glowing sword. The king did not look at Theon, but at the men gathered on the ice. "You know this man, Theon Greyjoy, Turncloak, Kinslayer." The titles fell like stones, the sound carrying across the frozen lake. "He has borne many names, and earned them all in blood and treachery." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. "Some among you," Stannis' gaze swept over them, "have argued the fire must cleanse his crimes." His jaw tightened. He turned slightly, his shadow long and stark upon the snow, pointing like a dagger at the weeping heart tree. "I mean to rule my kingdom, not as a conqueror from afar, but as your king. The law of the land is the law of the king, and northern law is clear. A man guilty of these crimes must die, and the man who passes the sentence must swing the sword. He paused to let the old words hang in the air. A few of the Northmen shifted, their eyes flickering from Stannis to the tree. The blood of Eddard Stark cries out for justice, for the king's justice, said the king. The men agreed. Some cheered and shouted for justice. Arya Stark, last of his line and Lady of Winterfell, begged for her savior's mercy for this creature. The crimes done to the north cannot go unanswered. Theon Greyjoy must die, but there may be honor and mercy in the manner of his passing. His hand went to the hilt of his sword. So I shall give you the justice of Winterfell, the justice of your fathers, before the eyes of your old gods. I, Stannis of House Baratheon, first of my name, will pass this sentence. He drew his sword in one slow, grating hiss of metal. The false light played on the faces in the crowd, on the red eyes of the heart tree. And I will swing the sword. Stannis, it whispered. The king froze. He looked around for the source of the voice, staring at the weeping eyes of the heart tree. Stannis blinked and finally turned his hard gaze upon Theon. You stand accused of the burning of Winterfell, the murder of its people and its rightful rulers, of rape and pillaging, breaking the king's peace, conspiring against the king, treason, and kinslaying. Your defense? Stannis, the tree whispered. Stannis. Stannis ignored it. I'm guilty, Theon said with tears in his eyes. I did it all. I deserve to die. Please, make it end. Do you have any last words? Live. The wind sighed through the branches, and for a moment the only sounds were the faint crackle of the brazier and the rhythm of the crowd's breath. Theon lifted his gaze to the ancient bleeding face in the bark. The red eyes seemed to hold his own. They know. The old gods. They were watching. He remembered Jane as a small girl in Winterfell's yard with lemon cake in her smile. His voice, when it came, was a broken thing. It carried no further than the king and the gods. Tell her, he whispered, if you see her, tell her I'm sorry, for everything. Tell her, he swallowed, the stone in his throat nearly choking him. Tell her the gods told me my name, there in Winterfell. She will know. No, a raven croaked. Then another. No, until the whole flock took up the word. No, 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 cried the blackbirds. He lowered his head for the king. The tears that fell from his eyes were hot against his frozen skin. I'm ready. No, 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 their cries grew more frantic. The old wood of the white tree groaned with the fluttering of hundreds of wings. The chorus of ravens turned into a cacophony. No, no, no. The king took hold of the glowing sword with both hands and said, I, Stannis of the House Baratheon, first of my name, king of the Andals and the Rhoynar and the First Men, lord of the Seven Kingdoms and protector of the realm, by my own word and law and the customs of my peoples, I do sentence you to die. The wind blew suddenly, whipping snow into the faces of the gathered host. Winterfell. From the heart tree came a final whisper. The king's arms trembled and lowered the sword. The false light of the blade cast dancing shadows against the white bark. The king shook his head. The hesitation lasted but a heartbeat. A nervous murmur spread around the frozen lake. The Northmen stared with wide eyes at the weeping face on the tree, its red eyes seemingly aflame in the glow of the brazier. No, no, no! The cries of the ravens were a shrieking chorus, a frenzy of black feathers and sharp talons. What do they know, he thought? That I am a turncloak, a killer, that I deserve this. Theon bowed his head. He was damned by the gods themselves. They know. The gods know all my sins. No! The ravens screamed. Stannis roared and raised his sword to strike. The ravens burst from the branches like a living shadow, a black spear aimed at the descending sword. Beaks and claws screeched against the steel with each new scratch. Wings battered Stannis' arms and face, a torrent of feathers and fury. Birds dropped dead all around them in their fight to stop the sword's descent. Stannis stumbled back, swatting wildly. The sword fell from his grasp, hissing as it plunged into the snow, its light snuffed into steam. Men shouted, drawing weapons, shielding their faces from the whirling birds. Others began to pray. Theon, forgotten, stayed on his knees. He looked up at the bloody face of the tree. No! 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 The birds shouted in unison. He felt their claws dig in as they started to land on his shoulders. Live! Live, they said. Theon, it whispered again. Live. Gods, Stannis said with eyes wide in terror. King was looking straight at him. Gods. Okay, so that was Theon 1, The Winds of Winter. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember, like I said, the whole point of this is to see whether this illusion was convincing. So before I reveal the stuff, before I pull back the curtain, pause the video and leave a comment down below, because that's the entire point of this, is leave a comment down below. What parts of it were George's and which parts of it were mine? Like, can you tell? Was the illusion convincing? Even if you did see through it, like, how close did I get? I'm very nervous about this because it could go horribly for me. Yeah, so I'll tell you my approach now. I followed my blueprint. I had a target of 12% Latin. So I was able to achieve 11.91% Latin density, which is very appropriate for Theon's sort of grounded perspective. And then I wrote 3,475 words, which is closer to early Game of Thrones chapter length and like Storm of Swords chapter length versus the original, which I thought was a little meandering. Maybe it's actually the same word count, but it just feels very meandering. I broke the chapter into plot points, so I read through the chapter again, and as I was reading, I noted down jots on my notepad about things that need to happen in the chapter, plot points that I need to hit, information that I need to convey, emotional beats that I need to get to, and then I just took that and discarded most of the chapter, and I rewrote it using the memory device to skip tedious negotiations and deliver information more naturally, and I just like ruthlessly cut through a lot of redundancies. And then I actually mixed in some of Martin's like verbatim sentences from the sample chapter and other bits of A Song of Ice and Fire with my own to test if the illusion actually works. About 20% of this is verbatim George Martin, and the rest is me mimicking this voice using the blueprint. So that's probably higher than you thought it was. 1 in 5 words is Martin's. It's substantially George Martin's work, and then the rest of it, of course, was a fake. Some key changes from the original chapter that I decided on. I moved Theon to the cellar instead of Stannis' room. I always thought this was really weird. This lets me skip tedious conversations that Theon wouldn't realistically witness while still conveying necessary information through the fragments that he overhears and the memories that he has. Also, going a bit further than George did and having Theon walk out to the lake gave me a lot of time to explore the emotional opportunities that I felt Martin missed in this chapter. Like, really, this whole chapter feels like an exposition dump, and we don't really get any thematic exploration or really exploration of how Theon is feeling. It's a big mystery about how Theon is feeling in this moment, and I really felt that he didn't focus on it. So I wanted to focus on how Theon feels about his situation and about Jane Poole, and exploring his guilt. I always read Theon as like starting to have feelings for Jane Poole. I don't know if he is in love with her yet, or if he realizes it yet, or if he just kind of likes her or something, or whether it's platonic. But I thought it was appropriate to have him realize that he loves her just as he's about to die, because I thought that was kind of like a very George thing to do about get the heart in conflict with itself, and oh my god, it's so terrible. But I thought that was appropriate to the chapter, and something that Martin kind of missed the opportunity to do. Like, even if he kept the same sort of chapter dynamic, you could easily throw that in there. There's no reason you really can't. And then I cut a lot of expository dialogue in favor of just like briefly summarizing what happened in those conversations and memory sequences. Like, we really didn't need to see all of these. And then I improved the pacing a lot by not dwelling on every single negotiation that Stannis has. There was this dynamic of like one person after another coming in the room, like it's a checklist of plot points that he's trying to hit. And then I added a different ending, because if Theon is going to die, it should be Theon dies and, right? Theon dies and something, and this should mean something. It should cause something. I also didn't want Theon to die because, I think everybody who's reading this chapter is going to expect me to take the safe route and have Theon die. It's kind of like what everybody expects, but I don't have the difficult task of actually following up this chapter and writing the consequences of what happens when Theon lives like this. So, yeah, I didn't start writing this with the idea that Theon was going to be alive. I thought I was writing a chapter where Theon was going to die and he was going to be executed in front of the heart tree. And I thought, you know what, maybe I won't have him die. Maybe I'll just have something else happen. And, things just kind of happened that way. A lot more than you might expect was GRRM's words. People who I showed this to ahead of time commented that I'm going to die today, he thought, right at the start. Didn't really sound like George, but I actually directly copy-pasted that from Song of Ice and Fire. His legs betrayed him is also something that George has said before when describing Tyrion falling down. And then the floor rushed up is kind of a Georgism. He often describes falling as like the floor rushed up to meet him, or the ground rushed up to meet him, or the water rushed up to meet him. He likes describing falling that way. Theon, my name is Theon. You have to remember your name. That's taken from earlier chapters, I think. And then the oak door opened with a gust of cold black wind and a swirl of snow is directly taken from the sampled chapter. And then this entire memory sequence of the escape from Winterfell, pretty much exactly copy-pasted from the sample chapter, other than I changed a few words here and there. My brother's debts is actually something that King Stannis says. He says it with Tycho Nestoris. And I just felt that this conversation really didn't land well, and we didn't really need to see it. And then the phrasing Lord Bolton would be upon them is something that Stannis says in that conversation, so I just repurposed it. And then Theon Turncloak is actually what Stannis says to Theon. It's one of the first things that he says. You fell, Umber saved her is something that Stannis says, but again, because we don't really have the Stannis conversation in this chapter, I wanted to save the line, and I just attributed it to somebody else. And then again, we have another long gap of more of my work until we have Stannis invoking the Law of the North. And I thought, since Stannis knew Ned Stark and spoke to him at some points, he used the exact words of Ned Stark because he's consciously invoking Ned here. The man who passes a sentence must swing the sword is something that Ned Stark said. So that's basically copied from a Ned chapter. And then I copied another thing from a Ned chapter, sentencing Theon to die. I copied this from Bran 1 and just changed, the names around. This is actually what Ned says. And again, I think it's appropriate to do because he's invoking Ned, and, it kind of gives a nice little parallel, a nice connection between Stannis and Ned, which I think is not really explored very well in the books. The bit with the ravens bursting out and kind of attacking the sword, that's another thing that's actually taken from George. Believe it or not, this does actually happen in A Clash of Kings. A lot of people seem to have missed this one, but Bloodraven can actually do this, and he does this to save Samwell's life way back at like Craster's Keep or something in A Clash of Kings. I was going to explore this later, but the ravens actually saved Sam almost exactly like this. So the idea that they could do this to Stannis as well is not actually far-fetched at all. We've seen this happen on the page, and I kind of got the sense that George needed to get Theon and Stannis in front of this tree somehow. It felt like he was struggling with how to figure out how to get them there. Maybe Asha can see that her boyfriend is like watching them in the tree and thinks that with his help she might be able to escape with Theon or kill Stannis at least. Maybe that's why they're going to the tree, or maybe he just needs to get them to the tree for this plot device of something happening with the tree. Maybe the tree speaks to them, maybe the ravens interfere. I don't know what's going to happen. Anyways, that was my sample chapter for The Winds of Winter using the blueprint. Hope you enjoyed it. So, in conclusion, what have we learned about George R. R. Martin's prose? George R. R. Martin's written voice is built on a consistent Latin density of around 12%, varied a little bit by character and situation. He also consistently uses the device of memories to hide exposition and clues. He also has strong early editing discipline that has weakened over time, and there are a bunch of specific Georgisms like dialogue structure, the use of the memories, bodily functions, and telling the reader people's emotions instead of kind of implying it. The popular criticism that Martin needs an editor is actually quantifiable. I went from cutting 10% in A Game of Thrones to 30+% in Dance with Dragons, but the core good stuff is still there. I think his word choices remain excellent. He just needs to remember how to kill his darlings. For readers, hopefully understanding these patterns helps you read Martin more closely and catch the clues that he plants when he plants them. And for writers, this blueprint gets you surprisingly close to his voice, I think. It's not perfect, but I think it's close enough to show that it's more than just vibes. Again, don't forget to leave a comment about whether the Theon chapter fooled you, how much of it fooled you, what you think of this analysis, and whether you've noticed any of these patterns in your own reading or any other patterns that I missed. Thanks for watching. Take care.